On Karina's work. I've actually read your thesis and very interesting reading it is indeed. What I'd like to say is that it's a very good example of how a very different approach to data gathering, ethnographic approach, which requires a much longer stay in the village than your traditional clipboard and pencil, jet in, jet out approach, and it shows up some very different findings. I'm not saying it's a substitute for quantitative surveys, but it should be done in parallel, and you do get some very interesting findings. So well done.
Yeah. Then we have yes, I don't even need, but you can.
Yes, it was a very interesting presentation, I think, on the Kenya program. I think the SIFs, it's $6 billion have already gone into the SIFs, and more is being planned to go into them. So these climate investment funds are a huge opportunity to scale up some of the work that's been done so far. I think it would be really interesting to know what ranking criteria were used, that the decision was made to do geothermal rather than anything else. I think it's still a really interesting question. How do you mainstream gender into the geothermal program? But I think it is an issue whether geothermal will lower the cost of electricity and whether it will make it more accessible to the poor. I mean, the presentation we heard on Kenya yesterday talked about exporting power to Tanzania and Ethiopia rather than it being very expensive to extend the grid and deliver electricity to poor households, not necessarily getting them as high-paying customers, so they're not seen as having a high value. I think that's a really big question that needs to be explored, and maybe using gender as a focal point. Thinking about the SIFs and the timing, I think there will be lots of SIF programs happening, and the timing is always very tight. Even as donors, we often don't get to find out where the missions are until quite close to the mission actually happening, usually in a period of 2 weeks. But there are civil society representatives on the SIF committees, and it would be interesting to know to what extent smaller civil society organisations can plug in to that broader network so that these issues are raised at the committee level.
Okay, thank you. Let's take the last question from Anne.
Maybe I need to clarify something. In Kenya, if you look at the energy sector, we are highly hydro, and we find when we have with climate change, it is not sustainable. So we are developing our geothermal much more because it is more sustainable, and we have not done a lot of development in that particular sector. So it's kind of like an affirmative action that we move more away from hydro and to more green energy, and also explore the geothermal, which we have a lot of areas that we need to go into. We have not developed it so much. So that's why there's this issue of going to geothermal as a way of increasing our power production. Because hydro, we normally are forced, like I said yesterday, to use IPPs, which are thermal and are very expensive because they are oil-based when we do not have enough capacity. So it's a way of trying to have various other areas of the power sector. Then I think that particular meeting I attended, isn't it? The one you attended? Yes, I think I attended. And I did ask why they went more into why they were more interested into the geothermal and not the issue of biogas and stuff. And that is one of the reasons. Because there's a great focus that we move towards trying to find other forms of energy apart from hydro. And two, geothermal is cheap in the long run, but very expensive to develop. If you want to develop it, you need a lot of money to develop the geothermal, but once it is on, it is much cheaper, and of course it will be much cheaper to the customers in the long run than when we are forced to use thermal, which is oil-based. Thank you.
Okay, it seems like she's answered the last question.
Okay.
And Lydia?
Yes, Anne was part of that team that was making noise on the floor that day, called on short notice. And I think one of the main criteria used was the ability to reach many people, whether it is especially households. And it was felt that with electrification and with the measures that have been put in place to increase connectivity, then more people would be reached with electrification. And there was also the issue of what the energy form was going to contribute in terms of increasing productive end use, that is income generation again. Geothermal won on that point. And then of course there is the issue of macroeconomics and what really supports the development of the economy in the country. These were the key criteria that were used. I mean, some of the two that I can remember offhand. But the document is available for perusal. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have come to the end. And in way of conclusion, we still feel that there's a constraint in terms of access to financing. We've also seen some of the interventions by Salco and Barefoot. And we've also seen IFC's contribution towards financing of, by gender and even women. And lastly, we also talked about gender mainstreaming in the climate investment. So basically, we can see there's some efforts that have been put, but I think there's still so much work that we need to do. Yeah, and I think we've come to the end. We're taking a 1 hour break.